This is the New Indians special series from Moscow, the vibrant capital city of Russia. And today we have with us Andrey Karneev. He is a professor of Asian Studies and heads the school at one of the most prestigious universities of Russia, that is HSE. He is also a veteran sinologist. He has written several articles on China and has spent a lot of his time in Soviet era in China as well as post-Soviet Union era. Welcome to Reason, the New Indians platform where we get to the reason behind the issues that concern you. Welcome to Reason.
Very good, very glad to welcome you in our university.
Thank you. Let me begin this conversation with the most hottest topic around the world today. There's a speculation that China is going to invade Taiwan. If you think China is going to invade Taiwan, what is the significance of Taiwan for China?
First of all, let me tell you that Taiwan is a part of China, and even the Americans acknowledge this fact. Our country, Russia, has always maintained this principle. Even in the period when the relations between two countries were quite tense, we never abstained from this principle. And first of all, Taiwan is a very special place in China. It has a very difficult history. It was under the Japanese occupation for half a century, and then after some time it was the period of Cold War, when Taiwan was ruled by Kuomintang, the nationalist party. It was the iron fist of General Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of this regime. So Taiwan is quite a special place. And I think that for the modern Chinese people, Taiwan is a symbol that China is not yet united. You know, in China's history, this notion of unity and disunity is very important, because if you talk about China entering the blossoming period, the period of ideal development, it certainly should be a united country. In China's history, the country saw a lot of times when it lost the unity, and certain parts of the country were ruled by semi-autonomous kings. But then came the period when the country was united again. And now I think that a lot of Chinese citizens, they are simply longing for a period when the country will be united once again. So Taiwan is just this symbol of very special dream that Chinese, ordinary Chinese and elite have about.
So tell me, why is it that Taiwanese government today does not acknowledge the point of view that you have? In fact, they have a very different point of view altogether. They invited Nancy Pelosi recently, and there was a complete drama over her visit in the West and also in other parts of the world. Why is there this difference of opinion on Taiwan being an innate part of China and Taiwan being a completely independent country?
Well, you see that not everybody in Taiwan is happy with Nancy Pelosi's visit. If you take the main opposition party, KMT, that is the nationalist party, that was established by Dr. Sun Yat-sen exactly 110 years ago, in 1912. And this party, it has always been saying that there is only one China, and there could not be two Chinas or one China and one Taiwan. So this party, although it is now in opposition, but it represents a segment of population that still thinks that we Taiwanese, we are part of bigger China.
In fact, they say that they are the real China. In fact, they say that in 49, they were the ones who were there to
Yes.
begin with.
By the way, Kuomintang has always maintained the one China principle, but they would not like to be united under PRC.
Yes.
They would like to someday unite under some other, maybe they...
So is it a question about power? Is it if Taiwanese government was given the authority and power, in that scenario you think Taiwan and China would be really one?
Well, we know that there is a huge asymmetry of power between China and small island of Taiwan. So we cannot imagine a situation when the two sides of Taiwan Strait would be united by Taiwan, by Kuomintang. But actually what they say in Kuomintang is that, you know, we would like to be united, but if mainland China will be a democratic, like here in Taiwan. So this is a big difference between political systems in mainland China and in Taiwan. So for example, if we take 10 or 20 years ago, there were people that were expecting that mainland China will probably go the same route as Taiwan. So also introduce multi-party system and things like this. But unfortunately, I think that this could happen only in some distant future. For the nearest future, we will see that the mainland China will still be ruled by CPC.
So do you foresee China or Chinese Communist Party becoming democratic, or do you see Taiwan becoming like China?
Well, I don't think that in the 5 or 10 or 15 years time, mainland China will change its political system, because now China has to go over a very dangerous period of development to find a new model of its development. So for the nearest future, I don't see this happening. But in the distant future, of course, I think that there could be some modernization of political system. And by the way, there is a notion shared even by Xi Jinping, who says that we need a fifth modernization. The modernization of political institutions. As for the Taiwan, you asked me about whether Taiwan will be captured or invaded. I prefer not to use invade, but of course China will react if Taiwan will declare independence. I think there are 3 or 4 scenarios when mainland China will attack Taiwan. One of scenarios if Taiwan government declares independence. But I don't think that Taiwan government will do such a mistake. So I think that for the foreseeable future, we will see the status quo being kept, because even mainland China is probably interested in keeping this status quo. You know, you cannot kill a chicken that gives you golden eggs. So Taiwan is a place that is very vibrant economy, producing a lot of electronic high-tech goods, and I think that probably China would like to keep it. But in the foreseeable future, of course, some kind of unification should happen.
Help me understand this. Taiwan is a democracy, yet it's prosperous, it's a very good economy, its growth is substantial. Then on the other hand, China in the last 32 years, even though it calls itself a communist state, is not really a communist state, but it's a very capitalistic state. Today, after 32 years, China is actually contesting the position number 1 in the global order. US has $25 trillion economy. China has $20 trillion economy. Make me understand, how is it that Taiwan, it's a democracy, is successful? China, Chinese Communist Party, pseudo-communist, pseudo-capitalist system, both are successful. How has this happened?
There are probably hundreds of theories explaining Taiwan economic miracle and mainland China economic miracle. And I personally like theories that describe China's success as combination of several factors: Confucianism, communism, and capitalism. So I think that the Chinese, they have somehow managed to tinker and find this peculiar model of development that could draw upon its own traditions, upon qualities that have kept Chinese businessmen very nimble and very agile in the past, and also the Chinese in the diaspora that are very successful economically, and they have managed to combine it with the discipline.
So it's China is in a way an experimentation where Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy of economy have come together. Is that right?
If we remember who was Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the real creator of Chinese miracle, yes, he was a communist, but he never treated communism like a theory. He used to say that I know only the ABC of communism, but he spent several years when he was very young in France, in the Soviet Union, so he was a leader with a wide worldview. And I think that he understood that you could combine the peculiar features of China with capitalism that was thriving in East Asia when he was starting his economic reforms. I mean, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, that were countries that he was using as a role model.
Now tell me, you're saying that Taiwan is also Chinese model or Taiwan is a Western model?
Well, you cannot call Taiwan a Western model because it was ruled by Japan for half a century, and also it has a very peculiar mixture of Chinese people who migrated from the mainland with some indigenous population. So it is really a crossover of different cultures, different traditions, and I think it's tradition of mainland and maritime cultures. And also, of course, it is a peculiar result of the Cold War, when the Americans, they were trying to make Taiwan a successful example to showcase the capitalist achievements to the Chinese people who were just across the strait.
So you think that the West actually succeeded in showcasing the success story of Taiwan, and that might have compelled Deng Xiaoping to open up China to the West?
Well, of course, we cannot attribute the success only to capitalism, because there are a lot of places in Asia and in Africa where capitalism has not yet produced the same result. But I think it's the combination of traditional qualities of Chinese people, like their ability to work very hard and their ability to trade, because China has produced generations of very sophisticated traders who were, remember the famous Admiral Zheng He, who traveled before Columbus in the beginning of 15th century. He traveled as far as eastern part of Africa. So I think that the combination of a lot of factors combined produced this peculiar result. But of course you should travel to Taiwan just to have the first-hand experience and meet with the people who are very hospitable and very, they like to be hospitable to foreigners. And I was lucky, I was several times in Taiwan. I was impressed by their sense of purpose and of course their respect for their traditional culture.
So China's relationship with Taiwan, keeping it aside, tell me, what is China geographically and historically? When we look at the map, how has China become what it is today? Was this always true historically, that China included parts of Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong? What was China historically and what is China today, and what has happened in between?
Well, you pose a very thorny question, because in the academic circles there are a lot of people discussing whether, for example, parts that were conquered by the Manchu invaders, whether they were originally Chinese or were conquered in the 17th and 18th centuries. So let me just abstain from this discussion. People in the West and in Russia, in China, they are discussing these difficult chapters of history of China. But we can safely say that China has historically China has seen periods of expansion and then contraction. And in the famous Tang Dynasty, or even in the Han Dynasty, Chinese were sending troops and were on the borders of the Roman Empire. That was 2000 years ago. And in the Tang Dynasty there was a famous battle between Arab forces and Chinese forces. But in certain periods China contracted to just the territory inside the Great Wall. So this is very hard to prove. But in the modern world, we live in the 21st century, this is very thorny issue. If you try to say that, historically this was not your, and this could bring conflict. So it is better to acknowledge the borders that we are having right now. Otherwise we could create some trouble and conflict.
Well, since geopolitics is a very thorny area, I will have to bring in India in this scenario, because India and China do have disputes over border. And that's why I was trying to understand what was China geographically over centuries. China, in the last 75 years of India's independence, had one war with India, that was in 1962. There's a dispute in the northern state of Ladakh, even as we're speaking. In fact, the troops got disengaged quite recently in Ladakh, where there was a standoff for the last few years. In Arunachal Pradesh, there is a border dispute. We have Dalai Lama, who is in exile in India. Tibet remains a major issue for Dalai Lama. So I want to understand, if we go by what you are saying, that we must now look at the map as of today and we must accept what Chinese borders or boundaries are. How can anybody accept the prevailing situation when there is already a dispute? Number one. Number two, that why should anyone, whether it's India or whether it's any other part of Asia, accept Chinese point of view about geography and boundaries?
Well, regarding the question of how could we deal with this border issue, I think that the only rational answer is to try to create conditions for some confidence between mutual confidence and trust between countries, and then slowly, and maybe such a problem could be solved in not in years but in decades. Take for example the problem of Soviet-Chinese border. Back in 1964, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, has said that, you know, that we have some problems with the Soviet Union. They took our territory, and the border negotiations lasted for several decades between Soviet Union and finally this problem was solved just in the very beginning of 21st century. So it took half a century for two countries to settle down the whole length of their border. But of course the precondition for such a solution was that, starting from Gorbachev visit to Beijing back in 1989, the relations between two countries improved. The problem between China and India is that both countries are quickly developing countries with huge potential, large population, huge economic growth, and also geopolitical ambitions. Both China and India will probably be the first and probably the second largest economies in foreseeable future. So this is probably explains why there is so much difficulty in accommodating these two giants. But I think in some distant or maybe not so distant future there will be some common ground for compromise. I think that two sides should make concessions. If you argue that one side should make concession, I think this is this is not a solution. So probably there should be a time when both sides will be ready for some concessions. That is for China and India border situation. We know that the trade between China and India is quite impressive, but this border situation is probably the most difficult problem currently in not allowing for more cooperation.
What you said earlier, that we must acknowledge and accept China as it is. If China continues to expand and China continues to have its ambitions growing bigger, you think the rest of the world can accommodate that? And where will this expansionism end?
Well, what you call expansionism, it's actually a commercial expansionism, because really China has grown since the beginning of economic reforms. It has grown its GDP just manifold times, and the Chinese companies are now globally present in every corner of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So I think that China's growth explains this behavior. Whether it's an expansion in traditional sense, like grabbing others' territory, I don't think so. And actually, the Chinese, they have their own anxieties, because they see that the West is trying to encircle China. For example, the recent initiatives like AUKUS and the Quad, and they see India also participating in this. So I think that if we try to look from their side, we will see that they also have this anxiety and feeling of insecurity. They are probably afraid that these countries that are encircling them will try to strangle them economically. So I think this very difficult picture that we have. But also, let me tell you that there is a theory in a recently published book in the United States saying that probably China will reach its peak of its growth in the forthcoming 10 years. After that, China will probably have a growth, but not so quick. And so probably we should wait for these 10 years and we will see that China will become a normal nation, not quite expansionist as you see it now.
So you're saying that for another 10 years we will have to just adjust with China's aspirations.
But Americans, they put forward this notion that the most dangerous period will be the forthcoming 10 years, because the Chinese leadership, as they see it, will probably try to do something very expansionist in the After that, probably they will calm down and it will be okay. So, but I personally do not subscribe to this logic. Although I could agree with the possibility that China at certain point will, because China has a lot of difficult problems, like they don't have enough resources and population problems. The population is not growing fast enough after decades of one-child policy. So probably those economists that predict that China will reach its peak in the forthcoming 10 years, probably they are not too far from the truth.
So my question is this, that while I accept that they have their own anxieties, but tell me, what do you say to Tibetans in exile, for example? They feel that they got occupied, China invaded Tibet, and it was occupied forcibly, without the will of the people. Do you think Tibet was a natural part of China to begin with?
This is also a very difficult question, because the official position of Russian government is that we try not to go into very much details about the Tibetan problem, but Tibetans have very influential backers, like the United States, European Union, so I think that there are enough powerful countries that could help Tibetans. I think that if China will find a model of accommodating, because China has not only Tibetans, they have Uyghurs in Xinjiang and some other problems. So if they will find a working formula for making these people develop and not suffer from any restrictions, I think even Tibetans someday will probably be pacified and will find possibilities for development. Because if we try to tear Tibet from China, this is a recipe for war, conflict, and I think that the destiny of Tibetan people would be much harsher than today. So I think that the best thing is for internal reforms inside China.
So when you say internal reforms within China, are we then saying that the Chinese Communist Party, one-party rule system, and the way the system works, it's a very closed society, closed system, it should open up and it should be more open to the ideas of democracy, the ideas of liberal West?
I think that China will never import Western style of democracy. But this is not to say that China does not have a potential for its own variant of democracy. And there are a lot of thinkers in China, intellectual circles, that are constantly thinking about how to develop democracy with Chinese characteristics. I think that eventually China will somehow grope for its own style of democracy, and because otherwise it will be trouble or even breakup of the country like we saw in the Soviet Union. So they should not import democracy lock, stock and barrel from Britain or from the United States, but try to develop and probably try to study the experience of countries, other Asian countries like India, like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, so to try to construct their own style of democracy. This is the only way for such a huge country as is China.
But is China showing signs, because Xi Jinping made himself president for life?
Yes, of course, in the nearest 5 or 10 years, I think that we will see only the current trend, this CPC even introducing more control mechanisms. But if we take a look at China's reforms over the last 40 years, we've seen that there's a pendulum swinging back and forth. So after a period of these restrictions and total control, there were periods of relaxing. So I think that in 10 years or 15 years time, the pendulum will swing back. And this will certainly happen. I bet on it.
And tell me, this confrontation between the West and China, where do you see this heading towards? Because we are seeing, for example, US President Joe Biden just yesterday has said that they will come and defend Taiwan if China attacks Taiwan. Constantly there is a messaging happening from the West that they stand by Taiwan and China dare not look at integration of Taiwan with the mainland China.
Well, this is quite peculiar because there was a tradition that the several American presidents, starting from Richard Nixon, they have said very clearly that we acknowledge we are for one China. So what President Biden is doing is probably because he just wants to provoke China.
Why?
My theory, probably I am not representing all Russian sinologists, but my own interpretation. I think that Americans are currently trying to provoke some internal contradictions inside the CPC, trying to...
Are there contradictions in Chinese Communist Party?
Well, of course, as in every political organization, there are contradictions, and probably the idea is to inspire some internal dissent, because the way Nancy Pelosi provoked China was that Americans showed that China was not able to do any harsh reaction, intercept the plane, or probably make it land some designated place. So I think that the idea was to show the Chinese population that Xi Jinping is a weak leader. He is only speaking toughly, but he cannot do anything about Americans' provocations. And if this is the case, it means that they are trying to destabilize, to wreak havoc to the current political system, which is very dangerous, because if in China we will see chaos and a new revolution, probably there will be tens of millions of people fleeing China. So I think it was Deng Xiaoping who once said, why do we want to topple our government? You will see that millions of Chinese will run across the borders. So I think this is a very dangerous policy, and it certainly is, I think it's bringing no good to Chinese people.
So, in essence, you're saying there will be status quo even as there's a confrontation between the West and China. No government which is reasonable will push China towards the path of war.
Well, I think that if Taiwan government makes mistakes, for example, declare independence or declare the change of the name of the country. For example, now Taiwan's official name is Republic of China. It's the same name as was in 100 years ago. And if it changes its name to Taiwan Republic, then the government in Beijing will have no choice but to attack. So that they were saying this for years. So if Taiwan makes any mistake, this could spell trouble and war. But I think that Taiwanese people are smart people, and they will be very careful in this respect. We had already several administrations by the Democratic Progressive Party, which is now in power, starting from the year of 2000. And they were very careful not to cross the red line.
So, you seem to be hinting that the West is interested in removing Xi Jinping. Is that the aim, to create dissent within the Chinese Communist Party and have a new leadership, which is more pro-West, or which is more, probably more pro-Joe Biden?
I think we could not exclude such a possibility that they see Xi Jinping personally as a force that is against the Western interests. Of course, they would like to see a leader in Beijing who is more like Gorbachev, or maybe a Chinese Gorbachev that will be more accommodative to Western interests. And basically, maybe not just to change one person, but to change the whole structure of China's political system. That could happen if there will be some dramatic events in China. I think that this is not good for the Chinese people, because they will face the crisis, the destruction, the loss of property, loss of life.
So what are Western interests in China? What exactly would they like Xi Jinping to do differently? What would they like this dissent that they are trying to create? What is the ultimate objective, and how will they gain it? How will they achieve it?
Well, if we remember Mike Pence, the former Vice President of the United States, he was claiming that before Xi Jinping, China was moving in the right direction. That is the theme of many American interviews and newspaper writings on China. So the main idea is that before Xi Jinping, China was slowly but steadily moving in the direction of the Western model, and introducing one after another certain elements of Western political system, even experimenting with democracy inside Communist Party and outside Communist Party, village elections and elections on the county level and stuff like this. But when Xi Jinping came, tell us the American academia, he started to put China backwards, back to the Mao, to the time of Chairman Mao, and that is what the West could not allow to do. So, but what are the real devices that the West could use? We still don't know yet. So, for example, if we take Nancy Pelosi's visit, some people say that this is just a whimsy of an elder statesman, but other people say that this could not have happened without the consent of President Biden, because they are from the same Democratic Party. So even for my own impression. I cannot produce any hard evidence, but this is my understanding of the possible way of thinking in Washington, in the White House.
So what you're saying is essentially that Xi Jinping is not really under the control of the West.
Of course not.
And what you're also saying is that Xi Jinping is good for China.
I think that for the current situation, when China is facing so many challenges, I think that probably he is the person who could keep this system intact. Otherwise, it could just start to unravel. And what could happen, we don't know. Even the appearance when in the 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, I think there was this crisis impression in the minds of a lot of Chinese, so that the boat was rocking very evidently. So Xi Jinping's mission was to try to stabilize Communist Party's rule in China and just allow China to go through this very dangerous period of development.
Well, this has been an absolutely enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. We hope that we get to interview you once again for a longer session.
Thank you for inviting me for this interview.
Thank you.